Thanks for coming. I'm Jane Vossler, and I want to welcome you on behalf of the Community Senior Center and the Richmond Historical Society. We're co-sponsoring this event. And while we're all snug in our homes, hopefully, on this cold winter day, Michael is down there in Florida. Can you show us how you've got your shirt sleeves on?
Short sleeves.
Short sleeves.
I didn't rub it in. Jane made me do it.
So some of you probably know from the publicity that Michael is a New York Times bestselling author, and he's the co-author, this is really impressive to me, of 30 books for adults and 7 for children and young adults. And is it 1 or 2 of your books, Michael, that have been turned into a movie?
Just the one, hoping for 2.
The Finest Hours is a Disney motion picture. It opened in 45 countries in January of 2016. So which one are you hoping is going to become another movie?
There's a new book coming out this spring called In Deep Water, an incredible survival at sea story that just happened 2 years ago.
Oh.
So that one's got a chance.
Good. So I'll turn it over to you, Michael, and we're ready to hear this edge of your seat story.
Okay. Hi, everyone. I feel like I kind of know this group because we've been together a couple times now. So I thought I'd give you a little background of how a book like this comes about. And oftentimes it's the one thing leads into another. So about maybe 7 or 8 years ago, I did a book called So Close to Home about a family who survives a U-boat attack right off the coast of New Orleans. And in the course of that research, I was researching the U-boat that sank the ship, and I found at the National Archives the U-boat commander's war diary. So I was like, whoa, perfect. I know what the U-boat commander was thinking, feeling, and ordering. And so, when that story ended, I kept reading his war diaries, and he mentioned this ship off the coast of Africa called the Laconia. And I started reading further, and I was shocked that he was involved in rescuing passengers off this ship that another U-boat had sunk. And I'm like, well, this is interesting. You don't hear of that. And so I started to do research with the co-author, and what was this Laconia all about? And I realized it's probably the strangest story in all of World War II. And then I was thinking, well, why haven't I heard of this if I'm a history buff? And it turns out it was covered up for many years by both the British government and the American government. So only a handful of people knew about it. Of course, the survivors knew, but they were all instructed that, you can talk about your survival stories, but not about your experience with the U-boats. So it wasn't until many years after this incident happened that the first reports started coming out. And by doing a lot of digging, I did find eyewitness accounts from survivors. So that's forms the basis of this book. It's not speculation. These are people who lived through it, who wrote down exactly what happened to them, whether it was in letters or unpublished manuscripts, and we were able to piece it together. And then, through the National Archives, some material from the German war government and the British and the Americans was available because it had been long since declassified. So that's how one book leads into another, and so I never know where things are going to take me. Sometimes, for this 2022 incident in Deep Water, the new book, it was just mentioned as an aside when I was talking to a Coast Guard rescue swimmer on a different project, and I said, "Whoa, stop right there!" And that's how it all comes about. So people say, "Oh, Mike, you love to write because you've done all these books." I go, "No, I don't. The writing will always be hard work. I love the research, though. And then once I do the research, I figure I can't let these people down. Got to tell the story." So where did this incident with the Laconia happen? Well, it was halfway, oh God, a good 400 miles off the coast of Africa. So, probably the nearest African country at the time was Liberia. And where you see those dots in the middle is where the action took place. But I put this particular map in the slide presentation to show where this little Ascension Island is, because towards the end of this story, that's going to play a role, even though it's, from the site of the U-boat torpedoing attack, land of Africa is 300 miles away, and Ascension Island is probably 200 miles away. I usually try to do the book in 3 parts, both for adults and for young adults. And one thing I learned, through my own reading was if I get flooded with too many characters in the first couple of chapters, I lose interest because I get the chapters confused, the characters confused. You don't feel a connection with them. And it's the connection that makes you want to turn the page. Like, okay, what happens to this person? Especially with nonfiction. So I've learned, keep it to maybe 4 or 5 primary characters. And then, of course, there's other characters in the book, but they're not those 4 or 5 that we're going to follow from the start of the incident or the ordeal to the end. And I've learned that's beneficial for both adult and young adults. I hear it from readers all the time. And in this case, it's not just people are involved. I talk about the ship itself, the Laconia, and the U-boat, because I had to learn how U-boats operate and how the commanders lead. So in a sense, those 2 vessels are characters in themselves. So the Laconia, I'm going to show you a picture in a moment. It was a 600-foot troop ship, so pretty good size, and beautiful ship, former luxury liner. It's off the coast of Africa in September of 1942. And because it's at the height of the war and there's so much carnage done by U-boats, the convoys are protecting more valuable ships than the Laconia, such as, fleets of troop ships with a whole bunch of troops on board, or oil tankers, a whole convoy with weapons. Whereas the Laconia, while there's a ton of people on board, 2,700, most of them are Italian POWs held down in those lower holds. And they had 100 Polish guards, and then the rest were British military, sailors, and spouses and children. So quite a mix on board. And here it is. You could see it in its all its former glory before it was turned into a troop ship. Kind of reminds me of the Titanic. And the story to me is just as interesting as the Titanic. And I think it would have been so much more widely known had it not been covered up, because of the amount of people involved. I'll have to compare the amount of people here, 2,800, to how many were on the Titanic. Maybe at the end, somebody will know that answer or can Google it, because I always wondered, was it the number of passengers similar? So as I mentioned, I've learned to, because of my own reading, limit the character. So we have the U-boat commander who sinks the ship. His name was Werner Hartenstein, very good U-boat ace. And then I really zero in on 3 survivors. And it was wonderful to find this female survivor, Doris Hawkins, who was a nurse. Because as you're going to learn, she's really tough, really courageous, and performed under duress better than most of the men. And then these two young sailors, particularly Tony Large, who left the most detailed account of his survival story after the attack, but both quite young. And Jim McLaughlin ended up in the same lifeboat as Doris Hawkins, so they actually become fast friends. So here's Tony Large. It was fascinating. I talk about him in my book, Extreme Survival, because he was really tough-minded. And I later realized why he was such a good survivalist on the boat, why he made good decisions and kept enduring when others gave up. And it was because he had been involved in a U-boat attack earlier than this one and had to survive. So he learned a few things about that. And I'll share one of the main lessons he learned that he applied to himself during this ordeal. It was really fascinating. And you know, some of those lessons I convert to, okay, how could we, all of us, use them when we're faced with adversity? And his lesson's a good one that I'll share. And by all means, if I forget, remind me at the end. So, you know, Doris Hawkins, up at the top there were also two other female characters who I briefly touch on because it's unusual in war to have these female survivors as well. The two others were quite young teenagers, but they had quite an ordeal as well. And the U-boats were these big Class 9 U-boats. So this is the largest of the German U-boats, and it had enough fuel on board that they could come all the way from their main base in Europe, which was occupied France, Lorient, all the way across the Atlantic, around the tip of Florida, could come into the Gulf of Mexico for the book so close to home, and never have to refuel. And so they could do a similar patrol all the way down the whole length of Africa, and again, not have to refuel. Unless they wanted to extend their trip, then there was a secret method of how to do that. And you know, in a nutshell, the way the U-boats operate is at night, they would try to come up on the surface and run on their diesel power. And that would recharge the batteries, which was how they would be powered when they were below the surface during the daytime. Because you wouldn't want to be on the surface during the daytime because the Allied aircraft could spot you. So it was that need to get up onto the surface that was a vulnerability with all the submarines back in World War II. Who knows how they, you know, today they're nuclear-powered submarines. You know, I'm sure they can stay underwater for months at a time. But the area that I really wanted to focus in on was the World War II era submarines, not just the U-boats, but also the Japanese submarines, because I co-wrote a book, In Harm's Way, about the sinking of the USS Indianapolis. The version I did is the condensed version with Doug Stanton. And, you know, just while I'm on that topic, the big difference in the way they conducted the war was the German Navy had a code of conduct, and that was once you sank the ship, you don't kill the survivors in the water, whereas Imperial Japan would strafe and try and kill any survivor in the water. And, you know, that's what's got me a little bit alarmed with what happened when we sank one of those Venezuelan boats. We came back and killed the survivors in the water. Even the U-boats didn't do that. And the one U-boat that did do that, he underwent a severe reprimand. And then during the Nuremberg trials, that U-boat commander was hung for doing that. So the Class 9, they could usually do a 6-week patrol, but say they were having what they called happy hunting, things were going well, and they wanted to extend their patrol, they could meet another U-boat, another Class 9, but it had nothing on it except fuel and extra torpedoes, and not the usual contingent of 55 men. Just, it was called the Milk Cow, and it would be available at a secret location for U-boats to rendezvous with and top off their fuel tanks. So the Milk Cows were out there as well, and they had a secret grid they could meet at. Eventually, the British cracked some of the code to the detriment of the U-boats. But in 1942, probably right around up to this September period of the Laconia incident, that first year of action against the United States, and then earlier, of course, with the British, they ruled the seas. They were incredible. And so Commander Hartenstein is the one on the U-boat that's going to sink the Laconia. And there's a photo of him here. He looks older here, like he's, well into his 40s, but he was in his early 30s. To give you a little bit of a glimpse inside a U-boat, and actually this particular U-boat, if you want to fly out to Chicago, you can go inside this. It's at the Museum of Science and Industry, and it is open to the public. It's the only U-boat here in the United States that you can go inside. And I did go inside, and you wonder how on earth did they get 55 men in? But these German sailors were so committed that they would even take out one of the extra bathrooms, just leave one for 55 men, just so they could pack on extra ammunition for the deck guns. So that's the conning tower up above, and you can see the anti-aircraft gun, the batteries. It would be brutal under there. The heat would be through the roof, particularly if you're off the coast of Africa. So, coming up at night wasn't just to refuel the batteries, but it did give the men a chance to breathe some fresh air and get out from below. And, quickly the uniforms came off. They were working in short pants, basically, no shirts, because it was just brutal. So they had so much success against the U.S. and earlier against the British that when they returned to Lorient, France, they were treated as conquering heroes. Elaborate parties were held. The commanders were whisked back to Germany on a special speed train to get 2 weeks off. And there were even playing cards with U-boat aces on them, like we would have playing cards for baseball players or football players. They had it for U-boat aces. So they were the toast of the town in the early days. But it didn't last long. When our technology advanced, these U-boat men knew they were on Earth for a limited time. And it was amazing that they still carried out their jobs, knowing they were eventually going to be sunk. Over 93% of the U-boat commanders did not survive the war. And they knew it too. So this is the big pens where they were kept safe in Lorient, France. German engineering was quite advanced, just a ton of concrete with rebars in there. And it was, I got a kick out of Winston Churchill's journal at the time. He said, we bombed the U-boat pens at Lorient, France, and we've done some real damage. But then you look at what Admiral Dönitz, the head of all the U-boats, wrote at the same time, and he said, the British bombed our pens at Lorient, but did absolutely no damage. Again, because they were so thick with the reinforced concrete. And here is Admiral Karl Dönitz, is the way that he pronounced his last name. Fascinating story behind him. He left a big memoir that was published, big volume of a book He served in World War I as a U-boat commander, was captured by the British. And while he's languishing in prison, he's thinking, boy, if there's ever another war, I'm going to do things differently. And of course, there is another war, and this time he's in charge of the U-boats, and he does a spectacular job. The problem was Hitler always thought he was smarter than his generals and oftentimes ignored their best advice. And, the good advice Dönitz had in the early stages of the war was, hey, we've got the British on their knees. Now is the time. Take every available U-boat, attack, attack, attack. And Hitler refused that suggestion, keeping 25% of the U-boats back in the North Sea, more in a defensive position. And, they had the British on their knees. And of course, then Hitler made the terrible mistake of attacking Russia when he hadn't even totally defeated the UK. But yet, despite that difference of opinion, Hitler apparently had high regard for Dönitz, because after Hitler killed himself in the bunker at the end of the war, he had left instructions saying, I want Admiral Karl Dönitz to be the next Führer, even though there wasn't much of Germany left. So it was actually Dönitz who signed the unconditional surrender. So we're going to get into the incident itself. The Laconia has come around Africa, through that would be the western side of Africa the eastern side of Africa. It's come around the Horn, and now it's coming up the western side, and that happens to be where Hartenstein and his U-boat are patrolling. So it's September 12th. They're 700 miles. I said 300 miles earlier. Excuse me, it's 700 miles off Africa. And it's at 8 p.m. when they're attacked. And how Hartenstein saw this ship was in the distance, he could see the smoke belching, and he knows there's some ship out there, and he goes closer. He recognizes that a British ship, realizes I don't need to attack during the daytime. It's coming right towards me. I'm just going to lie in wait for night. That's the safest time to launch the attack. And so again, here's where the action is. He launches 2 torpedoes into the Laconia, and it didn't sink right away, even though 2 torpedoes hit it. There was time, but it was chaos on board. And lurking in the sea, especially when you have a lot of injured people in the sea, are barracudas and sharks by the hundreds. And the Italians, who were the majority of the people on board, were not freed from their cages, but it's amazing what adrenaline can do when they rip the bars out. So now you have Italian POWs storming the life rafts and the few life vessels that aren't damaged. And you've got some guards shooting the Italian POWs. So if you can imagine, on the deck of the Laconia, there's just mass confusion. People looking for life jackets, people hurling themselves off the sides, and there's fires raging. This picture, by the way, is not the Laconia. This is an oil tanker being hit, but it was similar to this, where the survivors said parts of the ship were just ablaze, parts of the ocean with the oil on board, like you see in this photo, are blazing. A lot of people jumped right into the oil, so now they're covered with the dark oil, and those lucky enough got in the lifeboats, but they're crammed. And, you wouldn't think from any kind of incident like this we'd have photos, but it's amazing how much material from World War II survived and is at places like the National Archives, like the U-boat Museum in Germany, where we got some of the photos. And so Hartenstein is watching all this chaos. He's on the surface, he's up in the conning tower. He could see the Laconia tipping at an angle. He knows it's going to sink. He sees people in the water. And then as some of those people get closer to the sub, he hears help, help, but it's not in English, it's in Italian. And he puts two and two together and he realizes, oh my God, I just sank a ship with our allies, the Italians, on board. Probably, I don't know this for a fact, but probably making the assumption they were POWs. And so he makes a split decision. I can't just sit here and watch our allies suffer. I've got to try and rescue them. And because it's night, he can't tell the difference between Italian and British. So he tells his crew, rescue everybody and treat them well. And while the rescue is going on, he informs Admiral Dönitz of what he's doing. And Dönitz has a big decision. Do I allow him to do this? This has not been done before. I did come across cases of U-boats assisting people in the water by giving them, water if they're in a life raft or telling them which way land is, but never actually rescuing them and bringing them on board the U-boat. So Dönitz is wondering, what do I allow him to continue what he's doing? So as he's taking these survivors up, some are British men, and he doesn't allow them on the U-boat, but he puts them in lifeboats that are undamaged and ties them in a long string behind his U-boat. But if they're Italians or they're women and children, they're allowed to stay on the sub and be given blankets and hot tea. So Doris finds herself actually inside the sub talking to a couple of the Germans who can speak English. And Tony finds himself on a life raft being towed behind it. And here's an example of how the Germans were bringing up these lifeboats just crammed with people. And then as they take them off, keeping the British men in the lifeboats, but letting the women and children and the Italians off. But the U-boat is getting full to the brim. And the British women and children said they were treated really well, given blankets and tea. And one of the U-boat commanders I'm going to introduce you to later said it was kind of tough on our men, the German men, because having the women and children on board reminded them of their own families. And so, you had the German men going out of their way to assist them. So you had a little, or I won't say order was breaking down, but some of the U-boat sailors were spending way too much time assisting the British, is what one of the commanders was saying. And so in this photo, you could see like a German sailor, he's got the beret in the center standing with the shirt on, but these ones in the life vests without shirts, they were the Italian POWs. So they're put on the deck. Some of the women and children are taken below. And, in this photo, there's some room on the deck, but it's going to fill up pretty rapidly. So Dönitz is monitoring all this. He approves what Hartenstein's doing. And next, Dönitz has to tell Hitler. And Hartenstein says, I need help. My U-boat is filled. So Dönitz approves two other U-boats coming to his aid. And one of those U-boats was the one that I wrote about in So Close to Home. That same commander who I followed at the mouth of the Mississippi River turns out to be involved in the Laconia incident as well. So you had two books come out of just reading that one war diary. Hartenstein gets on the radio and on open communication, so everybody can hear, and he says, we're doing a rescue. This is a neutral area, and so there'll be no confusion. He has a big red cross painted on a sheet and puts that on the deck of the sub where it can be seen from the air. And so two additional U-boat commanders are coming, including Eric Verdeman on U-506. That sub I showed you over in Chicago was 505, so Verdeman was on the sister ship to that, 506, another big Class 9 one. Fascinating character. And so what I like is if you read So Close to Home first, it's almost like Abandoned Ship is the follow-up to it, because that same character comes back and you've gotten to know him in So Close to Home, and now he's a major player in Abandoned Ship. He's only 29 years old, well respected by the crew, kind of a serious young man. And the second U-boat was Harrow Shots, and he was much more, what's the word I'm looking for, colorful. In different incidents, survivors of ships that Harrow Shot sunk said he would pull right up to them. They thought they were going to be shot, and Shots would come up on deck in a pair of shorts and in perfect English would say, "Sorry about that." He'd go, "You have Roosevelt to blame for this." And then he'd go, "Here's some cigarettes, some water, some food, and row that way, and you're going to eventually hit land." So they were shocked. So he was quite colorful. And actually, his war diaries were more detailed than any that I was able to get my hands on that survived the war. In fact, he was admonished by Dönitz for Dönitz's words were, "Quit writing novels, stick to the facts," because it was so colorful. He didn't survive the war either. I write in Abandoned Ship exactly how he and Eric Verdeman died. It's one of the too few cases where we know exactly what happened, the mistakes that were made, and how they died. So they're taking off the British woman and children. I wish I knew if that was Doris or not in that picture, but I can't tell. There weren't that many female passengers on board, just a handful. And she ends up in a lifeboat later with, I think it was 51 men and just 2 women. So when the 2 additional U-boats come to continue rescuing everybody, they make the transfers so that U-boat in the distance is Hartenstein's, filled to the brim, and they're bringing passengers up to this second U-boat, which is probably Eric Verdeman's, and they're offloading some of these people or pulling rafts that way. Because they've got a little more room. So there's this kind of a complex rescue operation going on out there, and there's a Vichy French ship coming. The Vichy were the ones who collaborated with the Germans. That was kind of the south of France. It was called the Vichy part of France, where there was fewer German rule in the early days of occupied France. Whereas northern France, the Germans were swarming all over. Southern France, as long as they cooperated, they weren't quite as heavy-handed. That changed as the war went on, but in the early days. So a Vichy ship is going to come out and try and rescue people as well. And they're Hartenstein's continuing to announce what he's doing over the open radio. And by now, the Laconia is long since at the bottom of the ocean, and hundreds have perished, and quite a few from shark and barracuda attacks, similar to what happened with the Indianapolis. And so here you see a lot of the Italian POWs. Again, in the cell, they were just in a pair of shorts. Most of them didn't even have shirts on. It was hot even in the Laconia, but they've survived somehow, where many went down with the ship, could not get out of their cages on time. another angle of. So, another reason I show a number of these particular slides is it would be clear to any plane flying low overhead that this is not your usual German sub on the surface, that it's crammed with people, way more than German sailors would ever be on board. And that's what happens. An Allied aircraft comes overhead because they've learned about what's going on by the radio and they want to come and investigate. And it's a liberator from Ascension Island. And the pilot sees what's happening, sees the Red Cross, and he radios back to his commanders on Ascension Islands for instructions. And it's a while before the instructions come back. So he just does figure eights, up high, wondering, am I going to drop rescue supplies? What am I going to do? But he's shocked when the orders come back and it says sink sub. And at this point, he's just seeing the one sub by the original one, Hartenstein. And this is what a liberator looks like, very effective later in the war for finding subs and sinking them with depth charges, dropping them right out of the plane, and for spotting them for other planes to attack. So he asks, he goes, verify that, my instructions, what did you say? And it comes back, sink the sub. And so that's what he tries to do. Now, the logic behind what the Americans are doing is probably take advantage of an easy target, sink a U-boat, before it sinks more ships or before it shells Ascension Island, which had been done before. But yet they know there's survivors on board, and they know some of them must be British. So, it certainly came as a surprise to me that they would sink a sub with some of their own survivors on it. But that's what the powers that be decide to do. And the first depth charge dropped from the plane is off target. And I always, the pilot never admitted this, but I always thought he might have dropped that depth charge off target to give the people on board a warning, because, maybe he didn't like the orders. He didn't say that, but we know from survivors that he could have swooped right down and, dropped a bomb right down the hatch of the conning tower if he wanted to. So I think it was kind of like a warning. And of course, Hartenstein, when he sees what's happened, orders everybody off the sub that's British, and those Italians who can get down the hatch in time get into the sub. And some of the women and children are able to get in the sub as well as it dives. So the rescue boats that are being towed behind the sub are cut loose. They're on their own. And Tony Large was in one of them, and he said when the Liberator came back and dropped the next bomb, he said it landed right next to the U-boat and right next to our lifeboat and blew it to smithereens, and I ended up in the water. And Doris said that she happened to be on the upper deck when this happened, and in the chaos, she was swept into the ocean as well. So she almost made it. If she had stayed inside the U-boat, she would have been saved, because the U-boat, while it was damaged, it did not sink. And the next shot was on target. But by now the U-boats dive, alarm, alarm. So Doris slides into the sea. Tony's flung into the air, but he survives without injury. And he climbs into another lifeboat, which is packed. He ends up with, I think it was 54 men. And Doris ends up in one with, I think it was 51. So they're just crammed into these few lifeboats that are still floating. Some people are hanging on to the outside of them, but they were able to get inside. Now, those who were stayed, didn't drift too far from the scene, were picked up by that French ship, the Glory, and taken to prison camps in Africa if they were British. But most people were either trying to swim in the water, drift away, and perish, or the currents and the winds take the lifeboats far away from the scene, so the Glory never finds them. And that's what happens with Tony's lifeboats and Doris's lifeboats. So part 3 of the abandoned ship morphs into this incredible survival at sea story. These 2 people in particular, Jim McLaughlin as well. Those are the 3 I keyed on. Here are some of the people that are hanging onto an overturned lifeboat rescued by that ship Glory 2 days later. So it must have been a nightmare just trying to hang on there for 2 days in that position as the waves are battering it. But you want to be out of the water, even if you're off Africa and the water's warm, because, this new book, In Deep Water, they're in the Gulf of Mexico in the month of May for 28 hours treading water. And even though the water temperature is warm in the upper 70s, that will still suck your body heat away really fast, way faster than the same air temperature. So you want to get out of the water as much as you can, even if you're being scalded by the sun. So the saga turns into this survival at sea story, and Doris forms this friendship with Jim McLaughlin. She's a huge help to him. He credits her with saving his life by her optimistic talk, her nursing skills, trying to keep order in the boat as best she can. He's injured by a barracuda bite, but she nurses him back to health. Look at that. It was 68 people in a 30-foot. How do you get 68 people in a 30-foot boat? It's just unbelievable. They only have a little bit of water, some biscuit, and a little bit of chocolate. And they said the nights were actually freezing, and then the day it was just blistering sun. And then, of course, when you read the book, I want there to be a lot of surprises. So, there's a couple incidents that we investigated. Were they murder or not? I'll let the reader decide what happens. It's pretty harrowing. Because a lot of bad things can happen inside a lifeboat when people are starting to lose their minds. Doris was starting to keep a list of people, who's alive, who's dead. Now, Tony, he's in a different lifeboat, and incredibly, he's only one of 4 that make it out of the 51. And he chronicled one experience where one man was secretly taking sips. There's only a limited amount of drinking water, and they were done with that in no time. A lot of people died of dehydration, but he was caught drinking out of turn at night. And the first infraction, he was warned, that we the 51 people in the U-boat, in the life raft, have decided if anybody does that, the punishment is death. And yet this young man is so dehydrated, he tries to do it the next night as he's caught. And he knows what the punishment is. He doesn't even wait around for it. He just lowers himself over the lifeboat and swims away. It's unbelievable. Tony said he just watched the whole thing with disbelief. But he said we had to be that harsh, or it would have become, every man for himself. So the direction of the currents and the winds is blowing them actually in a decent direction, which would be to the northeast. And so they're being blown to, just not too far from Freetown. They're not being blown towards Ascension Island, which is that dot the other way. And a little hint, my main characters make it. Of course, how else would I know what happened if Doris and Tony and Jim didn't make it? Because they're the ones who left the most detailed accounts of anybody. And it's really about determination. But when they do make it, and you'll have to read how they do it, some real ingenuity, a little bit of luck, but mostly just grit. When they finally make their way into the hands of a British hospital, they're told that, of course, everybody's going to know the Laconia was sunk, but no one can know about what transpired with this U-boat. So they were told they cannot talk about that. And again, that's why the story wasn't that well known. And, I said I'd mention one of the techniques that Tony used to survive. And in the book Extreme Survival, I show other examples of people that used a similar technique. And I labeled the technique, quote, as long as it takes. In other words, he had no idea how long he was going to be at sea. Was he going to be found in 5 days, or would it be weeks? It turned out to be, I think in Tony's case, 7 weeks. It was just off the charts. How do you stay along that live with limited water, almost no food? But the way he did it was, he'd been through this before. He knew, do not get your hopes up of an early discovery. So I'll give you an example. At one point, they see an aircraft, and everybody on the lifeboat is waving to it, with clothing items and everything. And they figure the aircraft has seen them. Well, when it doesn't come back with, water and supplies to drop, they're crushed. They're absolutely crushed. And he said, many of them died that very night. So you can die with your spirit. Whereas he'd been through this before, knew that, nope, you cannot get your hopes up by seeing an aircraft. I'm going to survive as long as it takes, or I'm going to die trying. So he's not putting an artificial timeline on his rescue. And that's what he's encouraging a good shipmate who's next to him in the lifeboat to do. Just, we're taking this 1 hour at a time, and they keep stringing hours together. So there are, on my website, there are interviews with survivors. Of course, none of the survivors from this Laconia, but other survivors, and they talk about what keeps them going. And the one I like on there is WWII, in a more recent survival at sea incident, said when he was about to give up, the thing that kept him going was thinking of his daughter, this person in his life who needed him. She was only 14 years old. And every time he began to give up, he'd just hold a vision of her, and he'd say to himself, fight for Ashley. So sometimes it's good to have a bigger reason than yourself, this sense of purpose of what it is you're fighting for. And Doris's sense of purpose was, I'm going to help others, as many as I can. And I saw a real similarity between Doris and Dr. Haynes, who was on the Indianapolis and survived, because his mission was, even though he didn't have any medical supplies, help and make myself as useful as possible to these men in the life rafts. So he was doing something very similar to Doris. You know how I said she was keeping a list of who was alive, dead, names? Well, Dr. Haynes was doing the same. He was collecting dog tags from anybody he found that was dead, so he could at least return that to the family. So it was giving kind of each of them a sense of purpose. You need to be kind of doing something while you're in this predicament, no matter how limited it might be. But I don't just write survival at sea stories. There's all sorts of different books. There's a couple about Vermont. The one about my cabin in Vermont is There's a Porcupine in My Outhouse. I bought this cabin, almost 50 years ago. Yeah, in Woodbury, Vermont. And there was a porcupine living underneath where you sit in the outhouse, and everything went wrong while I tried to live there. But the good news is I survived, and I still own that cabin and still love it and have not improved it. All I've done is add on a little screen porch. And then for teenagers, if you have grandkids who think their parents are cringe-worthy, my daughter and I wrote a book, The Cringe Chronicles, on the top, where she writes about terrible vacations, having an incident with a shark, blowing up a kitchen in Italy, all because of my father's fault. But at the end of each chapter, she gives me one page for a rebuttal. So it's a really fun book. I wouldn't be saying it's fun if I didn't get that one page to give my side of the story. And then, so, the lesson I took away from the Laconia incident is that even in war, there's some humanity. Those British women and children were telling the Germans that, we're gonna spread the word of the kindness shown to us, but then of course it was covered up and they couldn't. So, even the enemy sometime who we paint with a broad brush is not the beast that we make them out to be. And again, the fortitude shown by some individuals to endure, I guess is the word, can be far higher than the survival charts that, say, the modern day Coast Guard uses to determine could anybody still be alive in the ocean. The mind can go far beyond what the body seemingly can take. So I'm going to stop sharing the slides and we can open it up to questions and comments and see if I can't get back to the main screen. Bear with me. Okay, good. I'm back. So yeah, you heard about a lot of strange World War II stories, but this is right up there. You can unmute your mics, ask questions, or Jane can see them in the chat, whatever's best for you. Sometimes by moving your cursor, you'll find where that microphone is to unmute it.
What's the sister ship and the Mississippi River book?
So believe it or not, that was by Harrow Schatz, who you met in this Laconia presentation. So he was the sister ship going into the Gulf of Mexico into the Mississippi River. And then the one that is U-505 at the Chicago Museum of Science and Industry was the only U-boat preserved intact that we captured and had it hauled to Chicago. And now it's a museum piece that people can board. They moved it outside of the museum and built a shelter around it. I went on board, God, it had to be 40 years ago, but it's mind-blowing how tight the quarters are. How these men did it, I don't know. I would have lost my mind after a week.
What's the name of the book for the 206?
So the So Close to Home is the name of the book where they come right to the mouth of the Mississippi River.
Great.
Yep, So Close to Home. And then, Abandoned Ship is kind of like the sequel to it because it involves the same two U-boat commanders just by chance. I'd love to say there's a third incident, but I didn't come across anything as gripping as these two U-boat aces were involved in, and they eventually were sunk by American aircraft. in So Close to Home, you actually will read how Eric Verdemans lost his life. He's one of the few U-boat commanders that survived the original attack and was swimming in the ocean for a while. So we know exactly what he was saying and doing. Any other questions or comments? I have a question for you. Did anybody in, say when you were studying in high school, know that U-boats came all the way into the Gulf of Mexico and sank dozens of ships? I didn't. And I wonder, was that the way our history books were back then, that they were one-sided, that we didn't want to show, our vulnerabilities? I don't know. But when I came across this story and saw one of them actually said, oh, we're in the mouth of the Mississippi River, because all of a sudden the ocean is silted a yellowish color. I was astounded. I was like, nobody taught me this before. What a book. Well, Jane, thank you for having me back again.
Thank you for coming back. Yeah, it was good. It was great.
And if you folks do need a laugh this cold winter, thank you, Robert. If you need a laugh, read There's a Porcupine in My Outhouse. There's, you name it, a Flatlander not knowing what he's doing up in the wilds of Vermont when he's just 22 years old.
I remember that book.
Yeah, that's me. A lot of people don't equate that book to these serious, World War II survival books because they're so very different. But that was my survival story. Have a great day, everyone. Jane, thank you so much.